Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
There's a lot of political debate around sex and sexuality these days.
There has been a wave of anti-lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender laws being passed across the country.
In a sweeping ruling that overturned a half a century of precedents, 5 justices ended the right of American women to choose abortion under the Constitution.
The Right to Contraception Act would safeguard access to birth control nationwide, but failed today to meet the 60 votes needed to pass in the Senate.
Today's debates over sex may seem intense, but they aren't new. Americans have long argued over which kinds of sex are, quote, acceptable. And as the saying goes, you have to understand the past to understand the present. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at the history of sex and sexuality across the U.S. Rebecca L. Davis is the Miller Family Endowed Early Career Professor of History at the University of Delaware and Professor of Women and Gender Studies. Her latest book is Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. Professor, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Before we get into this book, which is amazing and so much to talk about, I want to start with basic definition, because the ways that the general public talks about or thinks of concepts like sex and sexuality varies across so many spaces. For this book, how are you defining those concepts?
So I think about sex and sexuality as relating to people's desires, their sexual behaviors, their thoughts about the relationship between their desires and who they are, or their communities, or their faith. It also has to do always with gender. So the word gender isn't in the subtitle of the book, but so for example, I talk about transness and transgender people, but I try to do so in instances where I'm also talking about sex and sexuality, because it is actually a reactionary move to say that being trans is innately something sexual. So I was trying to sort of thread this very fine needle of understanding that when we talk about our desires and our identities related to those desires, that's what I mean by sex and sexuality, that things like our gender identities are very much wrapped up in those, but are distinct from our sexualities. So somebody's gender and their sexuality are not equivalent concepts.
What I hear from you is that identities are fluid and contextual. And part of the context is where people are, not just geographically, but where we are collectively in a period of time and understanding. And that kind of nuance and context, I think, is often missing from our understanding when people believe that these identities are new or that they are just something that people created overnight. Your book shows us there is a long history that is contentious and that often doesn't neatly align, but it's that history that brings us to where we are. Why did you think it was so important to release this book now, given that long historical arc? But what is it about this current context that made you say, this is the book that we need?
It had been a long time since anyone had attempted to take what we know about the history of sex and sexuality in America and put it between two covers. So it seemed like, sort of timely in that way. But also there was a larger urgency beyond the sort of nerdy, let's do a book urgency. There was the urgency of a time when we are hearing people talk about gender, sex, and sexuality constantly in our politics, but also waging a war on history. And I was actually just listening to your interview with Jason Stanley and thinking about, his sort of philosophical approach to why we're seeing a war on history. And so much of attempts to get history out of certain kinds of history out of public schools and universities to limit the books kids can access in libraries is about sex and sexuality. And people are throwing around this sort of false narrative, these myths about the history of sexuality to justify a lot of what's going on in our politics today. And so I felt a real sense of urgency to correct that and to give people who support, sexual equality, sexual rights, sexual justice, a history that they could use that would, because in fact, when we look at the history, we do see change, we see debate, we see, it's not a beautiful history. There's lots of violence, there's lots of conflict. So it's not as if we go back and discover some golden era where everybody accepted everyone else. What we discover is just what you were saying earlier, that there's no fixed set of identities. There's no point in time where everyone agreed on what a man was, what a woman was, what's moral, what's immoral. It has always been a debate, and it's been a debate that has always been important to people and to their communities. And what was funny is, writing books always takes longer than you think it's going to take. And so I would despair and email my editor and say, oh no, I just, this is the moment, something big has just happened, my book's not done yet, and it's going to miss its moment. And he said, don't worry, there's always going to be something going on when this book is published to make it relevant. And he was right. I mean, we're so entrenched in these arguments.
I think it's also the power of history, of studying history, of writing about it, that it isn't something that just happened a long time ago. That history is informing us today. The ways that you said people are attempting to erase history or to remake history to fit a particular narrative. And as you were talking about that urgency and wanting to get it right, I kept thinking of how absurd it is that there are members of Congress asking people, well, can you define what a woman is? Do you know what a woman is? And the academic in me kept thinking, well, at what point of time and where, and what's the race of this woman? What's the class status of this woman? How does all of that shape what people think a woman is, but also what a woman is entitled to? And that is so interconnected to what you have here. People often think of these terms, sex and sexuality, as being taboo, but partially because it is so interconnected to views on morality. How do you tease that out in your book of thinking about morality becomes this arc to limit people, but also to punish people for, and often gender is at the core of that, to punish certain people from deviating what those in power or control have decided? How does morality play into this?
There are so many, that's a great question. There's, from the earlier period that I study up through the more contemporary parts of the book, there are people who really want to control the narrative, and they want to control what other people know about sex. And they do so because it is so important and because it is such a powerful way both to express who you are and to experience pleasure, but also to have some measure of control over your life or for someone else to exert that control over you. And morality comes in both in, and it's not necessarily a negative thing. I mean, I think there are communities of people for whom sexual expression is part of how they understand their relationship to the cosmos, to the natural world, to spirits, to ancestors, right? So there's nothing about religion or morality that's necessarily toxic to sexuality, right? There are many examples in the book, of people we might disagree with the choices they made, but of people very self-consciously deciding that their faith, their morals, their religion, and compel them to be, chaste before marriage, to be polygamous, to live communally, right? There are all kinds of these things going on. But there's another set of actors who really believe that they know the one answer to these questions, and that it is somehow they take it upon themselves. They feel that, God has anointed them to tell other people what to do with their bodies and how to behave. And that's when we really see people like Anthony Comstock, who in the 1870s convinces Congress to pass a law that he's basically written for them to define obscenity extremely broadly, including contraception and abortion, and to empower him to have a federal role over regulating the US mail to investigate violations of this law. And, he's somebody who really sees his personal faith as entitling him to exercise this authority. But what's key in that instance, and what makes it so powerful and different, is that he's not just acting alone as a moral agent. And that's where, American history gets so, to me, fascinating, but also can be so dangerous to people at the time, is that he has the power of the government behind him. He's not simply a moral or religious agent deciding that he knows what's right and he knows what's wrong when it comes to sex. He's able to get federal authority. He inspires state legislators to pass similar state level laws. And that's, before that, you didn't have police, knocking on people's doors to look and see if they had any porn, stashed under the mattress. You didn't have people proactively investigating sex crimes. We live now in that era, right? We live in a world that Anthony Comstock and his supporters created because so he does this in 1873. He lives till about 1915, 1916. And it's around the time that he's, toward the end of his life is when we see more and more police departments going out and proactively looking for people to define as vagrants or as sex workers, to arrest people. You start seeing men arrested for having sex with other men in very large numbers, which had never happened before in American history. They sort of proactively looking for sexual crimes. So it's a moral argument that has power in the United States because it gets government support and police power. In and of itself, I think morality is so important to how people think about what they should or shouldn't be doing sexually. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be just how people move through life. Sex is powerful and complicated and often contradictory for people. And it makes sense that religion and morality would give people a way to sort through what they want to do about those experiences. But it's the linking of the two, linking of religion and the state, that really changes the direction of the country.
You're listening to my conversation with historian Rebecca L. Davis, author of Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. Coming up, we'll learn about a person in colonial Virginia who identified as both male and female. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're looking at America's sexual past with historian Rebecca L. Davis. She's author of the book Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. In the book, Davis writes about how indigenous communities had a different understanding of sexuality than the Europeans who came to North America. I asked Professor Davis to talk about those differences. A note to our listeners, this interview contains discussions of sexual assault.
So if we try to imagine North America around, 1600, 1650, 1700, it is very much dominated by indigenous nations and empires. There are these tiny numbers of European settlements, military outposts, missions, if we're looking at the Spanish Southwest, but all of the trade routes, all of the commerce is still dominated by indigenous North Americans. So, but in these places of European contact, due both to diseases that indigenous people haven't, encountered before, due to Europeans coming with guns and things like this, they are able to exert a level of control over the people that they are in immediate contact with. And one of the things that's fascinating is in these encounters, all of the groups involved have a more sort of social or communal understanding of sex and sexuality. They see their sexual behaviors as not like, this is my identity and therefore I do these things or desire these things. They see it as their behavior reflecting how their community understands the right way to live. and that they are part of either they're wanting to be in English, show that they're a gentleman, show that they have civility, show that they are respectable in a English manly kind of way, or they're Franciscan friars in New Mexico and really wanting to show that they walk with God, or they're, Pueblo people who believe that their sexuality comes from the ancestors and from the natural world and is a reflection of forces much larger than them, that they are part of this sort of cosmic balance of male and female energies. So that's what they all share, right? It's not an individual-based idea of sexuality. And so what's fascinating is to see what happens when those different views collide. And the European actors, in addition to seeing, sex as a sign of civility, they also see Christian morality, whether they're Roman Catholic or Protestant, as prescribing very specific sexual behaviors and prohibiting others. And so they want to remake Indigenous people into their image of what a moral person is. And so as they go out to convert Indigenous people to a Catholic or a Protestant version of Christianity, they are looking at these folks' sexual behaviors very closely and scrutinizing them and seeing like what needs to change. So, for example, giving up polygamy and having only monogamous marriage becomes for these Europeans an indication that Indigenous people have not only said the words to convert, but have fully converted. But meanwhile, what we know from amazing historical research by scholars of this period and of Indigenous people and oral traditions is that often Indigenous people would behave one way within the mission walls and still had another wife or another husband in their village outside the mission walls, that they were attempting to navigate in a violent, difficult world and had strategically and may have believed, right? And we can't necessarily say this was all just pragmatic, but they very strategically adapted to what they were hearing and learning within, say, the Catholic mission walls in the Southwest, and what they knew from growing up, from their elders, from their community. So people really navigated these tensions in creative ways. It wasn't just like the Europeans came and imposed their views and then everybody sort of got, changed what they were doing to conform to that. There was a lot of negotiation. And it's interesting, too, because women in many Indigenous North American nations had a lot more sexual autonomy than European women did. And so there's also this very small little moments where we can see in the record of questioning or curiosity about Indigenous women's sexual behavior and sort of whether that would affect what European women did too. So we always have to keep our minds open to this. It seems self-evident, but has so rarely been understood by historians this way, that Europeans were learning from Indigenous people, right? Like it's not that there are these other ways of being sexual, of being in family, of being in community. And everyone was learning from each other. Certain people had more power than others, but that doesn't mean that people didn't take different messages from those conflicts.
When we think of sexuality as also being a form of resistance, of holding on to traditions and understandings and connections, but also the code switching that happens to understand certain things have to be done as a mode of survival, that there is learning happening across spaces and across people, but also the ways that people understand, even if I fully conform to this thing or this way that you're telling me, that still does not keep me safe. You just may choose another thing or another way to be. Share with our listeners the story about a person in colonial Virginia who went by both Thomas Hall and Thomasine Hall. Share that story.
So this individual was born in England and learned to be a seamstress with their aunt and was called Thomasine. Their older brother served in the English army, and so they followed the brother into the army as a soldier named Thomas, and then subsequently sailed for Virginia. This is in the 1620s. So Virginia was several hundred people. It was not, it was these tiny little outposts, basically military outposts with a little bit of agriculture happening, plantation agriculture happening. And Virginia was also at the time, the workers were indentured servants. There were a very small number of enslaved Africans who had arrived. It's extremely historically significant. They are in the perhaps dozens, very small numbers by 1628, around the time that Thomasine Hall arrives as a female domestic servant. And Hall is an indentured servant, most likely, like most of the people performing the domestic labor and the agricultural labor at the time. And that's important because there were lots of restrictions on what indentured servants could do. They were not allowed to get married for the most part. And because premarital sex was illegal, they basically could not have sex without getting in trouble. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Some of them were, sort of Christian moral reasons, but a lot of it was like, no, your job is to work. Your job is not to get pregnant and need time off. Your job is not to suddenly decide that taking care of your wife and child is more important than doing the work you're being told to do in the field. Absolutely not. You will not get married. So trouble begins because Thomasine Hall is found in the bed with another, probably also indentured servant we only know her as named Great Bess. This was by itself not remarkable at all. People were sharing beds everywhere in early modern Europe, in early America. It was very cold. There were very few beds. And, a bed was perhaps, you'd have a table, a couple chairs, and a bed if you had furniture in one of these very rudimentary homes. But another man who worked in the community was like, no, that's Thomas Hall, not Thomasine Hall. And he is getting away with getting frisky in bed with Great Bess, while the rest of us aren't allowed to be doing that. And so there were a series of investigations to figure out, was Hall a man? Was Hall a woman? There were forced inspections of Hall's body, which were very aggressive. And we don't have Hall's words about what that experience was like. It seems that sometimes they sort of grabbed Hall and threw Hall to the ground and did this. We can think of these now as assaultive, obviously, but at the time, there were not values around bodily privacy that we would have today. So, for example, if a woman was accused of a crime of, say, being pregnant, or if not being a virgin, she would be forcibly examined by other women in the community. And this was true of early modern England and Europe, and it was true of these English settlements. So Hall gets examined multiple times. And what's fascinating is that people look at Hall's naked body and reach different conclusions about whether Hall is a man or whether Hall is a woman. And Hall, for their part, refuses to choose one category, right? It says either I'm neither, I'm both. And it goes before the highest authorities, the highest English authorities, I should say, in Virginia at the time. And so we have this 2 pages of trial transcript from this case, which is the entirety of that immediate record of Hall. And historians have been able to try to trace them to the sort of English context. But of what happened to Hall in Virginia, we have these 2 pages from the General Court of Virginia record book. And it says that Hall was sentenced by the court to wear both male and female clothing, which would have been a sort of humiliation, right? To say that you have to wear these clothes, that you basically you will never be able to marry, right? Indentured servants, unlike an enslaved person, could serve their term, their 7 years, and then become a free person who could acquire land of their own and build a family of their own. They're saying to Hall, because we are legally defining you as both or as neither, you don't really have a sex. You don't really have what we would today call gender. And so you can't do any of those things. Hall was not convicted of a crime. Hall was not whipped in the public square or, any of the other, crude corporal punishments that were extremely common in the English justice system. And we don't know what happens to Hall after that. But it is, for the English people of the time, there were rights that came, there were entitlements to being a free man. and you could have a say in your local government, and you could own land, and you could get married. And this becomes a question of, does this person, who is sometimes woman and sometimes man, will they ever be able to have that status? Will this person ever be able to have the status of a wife who has the protections and the respect of the wife of a free English man? And so that's what's taken away from Hall at the end of the case. But it's fascinating because it gives us, I think, this opportunity to imagine, that what we think of, this idea that, well, there is male and there is female, and that's so obvious, and we all know what it is. Your example of, people being asked this in Congress. That no, this has in fact been a question of what is, what mattered to these English people was, they were trying to figure out, based on Hall's external genitals, what their sex was. But it came down to, what role will this person have in the community? What entitlements and freedoms will they have? And that's what they thought about. It was really more, where does this person going to fit in our community? What social roles will they fulfill? And they were, in the end, they sort of threw up their hands about the whole, like, well, is this person, physically one or the other? I mean, we can now imagine maybe Hall had one of the many intersex differences of sexual development. Who knows? Who knows what they saw when there's some descriptions of Hall's body that we can sort of conjecture what that meant. But to them, it was beside the point. The point was like, is this person going to have certain rights or not?
You're listening to my conversation with Professor Rebecca L. Davis. We're talking about her new book, Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. Coming up, we'll talk about the intersections between race and sexuality in U.S. history. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with Rebecca L. Davis, professor of history and women and gender studies. Her latest book is Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. The book includes many stories of what modern readers might call queer relationships. One of those relationships takes place in 19th century Connecticut, and it spotlights two people, Rebecca Primus and Addie Brown. Ask Professor Davis what we can learn from that era. And a note for our listeners, this interview contains discussions of sexual assault.
I'm so glad. They're two of the absolute favorite people that I had the gift of spending time with as I was researching this book. So what we see generally in the 1800s in, by this point, the United States, is a very broad acceptance of certain kinds of erotic relationships among female friends, among male friends, that were technically probably in some way criminal in most states and not prosecuted at all, but also not self-understood as being criminal or deviant actions. So we see there's a big new book and documentary out about Abraham Lincoln, lover of men. And they get it so right there that this is not to say that these folks were bisexuals or homosexuals or lesbians or gay or whatever. They lived within a world in which there was marriage, right? Which was this esteemed status relationship between a man and a woman for the purposes of forming a household and bearing and raising children. And then there was a whole other world of the intimate affections and pleasures that people might share, mostly before marriage, right, is the general way that this was understood. That could involve, and that was most safely enjoyed in some ways with members of the same sex. So you're avoiding chances of premarital pregnancy. But that also young people or people in their 20s could freely express these desires. So Rebecca Primus and Addie Brown were two Black women in Connecticut. Rebecca Primus came from an educated middle-class family. Her parents were very well respected in the community, in their church. And it seems that they ran a sort of employment bureau from their home for working class Black people who needed jobs as domestics, for example. And I should say that there's other scholars who discovered the letters between them, and Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin has edited a book where she collected all of these letters. So I did not discover these phenomenal women, but they. It's the moments in history when I get all chipped, when like my sort of scholarly veneer drops and I get emotional. So they loved each other deeply, and we know this because we have the letters that Addie, who was self-educated, wrote to Rebecca in her sort of her sort of self-invented spellings and grammar. And it's when you read 1800s letters by working class people, it's like you're hearing them talk, because people who have less formal education, they try to write as they speak. And so it's this incredibly moving, almost poetic way of expressing her love in her letters. And they loved one another passionately, and they shared beds, and they had clearly erotic experiences together we can see that in the letters. But Addie has a tragically short life, which was, and she sort of disappears from the historical record. And Rebecca goes on to, immediately after the Civil War, she goes to Maryland and founds a school to educate formerly enslaved people. The school is subsequently named for her. She gets married in her 40s, does not have children. Her husband has one of the highest civil servant jobs for a Black man in Connecticut at the time. And she dies well into the 20th century. And she gives her papers to the Connecticut Historical Society. And here's where I get emotional. By the time of her death, people were starting to get arrested for being queer. Police were raiding bars and clubs where they thought lesbians or gay men would be congregating. Cross-dressing had become, illegal in many cities. There were all kinds of new restrictions on sexual self-expression for women of color in particular. She saved the letters. She didn't burn them, right? So often we even know that we find evidence of people saying, I burned all the letters from so-and-so, and we all weep in historian, but she saved them. And so she wanted us to know. She wanted her descendants, and she wanted all of us to know that she had this great love with this other woman, and that was something that was precious to her. So I think that, we've come across these gems in the historical record. I should say these are the only letters historians have found between two Black women in the 19th century, expressing this kind of intimate, romantic, sexual love for each other. This is it. These gorgeous letters. So she both lived at a time, had her relationship with Addie at a time when her parents knew that Addie was staying over in her bedroom, right? Like nobody was coming after her to tell her not to do this. And she, at the time of her death, made a statement by saying that she wanted the knowledge of that to be preserved.
I think people often assume that academics, writers are supposed to just be the facts only, totally objective, whatever that means. And it's often a silly premise to me. There is a reverence that comes through in your writing, a reverence for the people, a reverence for the deep humanity of the people whose stories you now have the privilege of telling. And a part of this book, the reverence within this book for me, that I think speaks so highly to who you are as a scholar, is that you are intentional about including these stories and experiences of people of color. When for many historians, whether it's difficult to find the records or thinking about who are the central actors in this, those experiences often get erased or they get reduced. And what your book challenges us to think about is how race can become a part of the restriction, but also the evolution. And what it took for this woman to say, I want people after me to know that I had this great love and that I'm not ashamed of that, but keenly aware of what it meant within her community as well as in the broader society. How does these sort of stereotypes and understandings, particularly of women of color, but people of color more broadly, how does that align with this evolution that you see throughout the book?
Well, thank you. I cried a lot as I was writing this book. I mean, I think that as an aside, I think when you're writing about trauma, it is only understandable that you will be affected by what you're writing about when you're writing and reading about loss and violence. So I think anybody who does work in this field has to learn strategies for self-care as you're working through some often very difficult material. So race is essential to the history of sex and sexuality in America. And it's one of the themes of the book is the way that race making, of creating ideas of racial difference, also is an engine of the change that we see in sex and sexuality. So, for instance, there's a chapter about the emergence of a sort of self-consciously different community-based gay male identity around the turn of the 20th century, like 1890s through 1930s is often where historians see this idea of the sort of gay man as an identity emerge. But what I found in my own research and in reading the work of other historians was so often there were symbols of Asianness incorporated into expressions of a gay aesthetic. And I found that really interesting. I knew already that there was this sort of fetishization of women from the Middle East in a lot of American sexual conversation around that time. I was really interested to see like this figure of the Chinese or the Japanese man or Chinese or Japanese culture in gay male culture in the United States. There's also in Miami at the time, a historian Julio Capó has done great work on how sort of this idea of this sort of exotic Miami experience with people from Spanish-speaking countries and laborers from the Bahamas created this sort of tourist fantasy of sexual pleasure. So race is all through the book. These are both in some ways, if we're going to get really meta, ways of explaining difference, ways of making sense of who I am versus who you are and who they are and what do we have in common and what makes us different. But so much of American history is grounded in these experiences of dividing people into racial groups in order to run an economy, in order to create a government in which those differences are foundational, right? So making differences that permit you to treat certain people horribly through the Atlantic slave trade and through the whole system of slavery that evolved in the United States, through the treatment of laborers from, China and from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? There's this whole system of difference making that is so fundamental to the whole origins of this country. And when we look at the history of sex and sexuality, we see those intersections. We see, for example, stereotypes about women of African descent as sort of, they don't care about sexual morality anyway, so you can do these horrible things and they don't really mind, which is, of course, like grotesquely false. And you see this, and it becomes a rationale for horrendous generations of sexual exploitation of Black women in the United States. So those stereotypes become part of the whole fabric of the economy, of the political system. One of the justifications that white Southern defenders of slavery gave for the system of slavery, for why it was just, why it was Christian and moral and righteous to continue slavery, was, well, look at their sexual morals. They're clearly need our Christian guidance so that they could, learn whatever. And this is all false, and this is all, obviously very repellent. But sexuality becomes fundamental to the whole development of our sense of, what our government is going to be, how our economy is going to be.
I appreciate that this book makes it clear that the subject that we have been told is so taboo is actually so central to the economy, the growth, the history, the development of this country. And the other piece, Professor, that is so powerful is that you remind us of these places and sites of resistance, of activists, of communities coming together to say that definition will not define us. And on a topic that is so challenging, it gives us hope about the possibility to move forward. Rebecca L. Davis is the Miller Family Endowed Early Career Professor of History at the University of Delaware. She's also Professor of Women and Gender Studies. Her latest book is Fierce Desires, A New History of Sex and Sexuality in America. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.